All right. Thanks, everybody. Great to be here. Excited to talk to you today about really the changing nature of cloud networking. I missed a clicker here. Hey, guys. Oh, is this it up here? That's important. There we go. Excited to talk to you today about the changing face of cloud networking, sort of what's happening in the industry, but we thought we'd do it through the lens of, given how much history changing and history making we're doing right now in the current build out that we've been talking about all throughout the event. We thought we'd put this through the lens of a different moment in history where things transformed and that disrupted a totally different industry, and maybe have a little bit of fun while we're at it. So thought we'd talk a little bit about what Bob Dylan can teach us about cloud networking. And this talk was inspired by a film that came out last year. It's called A Complete Unknown. If you haven't seen it, it was directed by James Mangold. Timothée Chalamet stars and plays the role of Bob Dylan all throughout the film. But the film is actually based on an earlier book called Dylan Goes Electric by Elijah Wald. And it is in the subtitle of the book, it's really about, and it kind of leads up to, and it really opens up and starts, the whole book starts off with this moment in history, the night that split the 60s, as the subtitle of the book calls it. And I'll read from the beginning of that book and sort of set the stage for everybody. It starts off on July 25th, 1965. Dylan took the stage at the Newport Folk Festival in black jeans, black boots, and a black leather jacket, carrying a Fender Stratocaster in place of his famous acoustic guitar. The crowd started shifting restlessly as he tested his tuning. It was joined by a quintet of backing musicians. And then the band crashed into a raw Chicago boogie, and straining to be heard over the loudest music to ever hit the Newport Folk Festival, he snarled his opening line. So this is a moment that split the world of popular music, certainly split the folk scene. And so what happened next is obscured by conflicting stories and recollections through the years, but in some tellings, Pete Seeger, who was one of the forces behind the Newport Folk Festival and really a main player in the folk scene in general, sort of like the Nan Chen of the 1960s folk, if that resonates for everyone. He apparently tried to, the story goes, he tried to cut the sound cables with an axe. He was running around backstage going crazy. Would this have been the most important fiber cut in the history of music? Would this have been one of the most important network outages in the history of modern art? We won't know, but I think it's an interesting moment that we jump off into, and it begs the question, what can Bob Dylan teach us about cloud networking? Well, maybe not much. Maybe if we drop Bob Dylan and the Paul Butterfield Blues Band into the middle of a network gateway or a cloud data center, they might get a little lost. So maybe there's not a literal message here. Maybe there's not a literal connection between the two. But maybe what we should do is delve deeper here. Maybe we should dig into the lyrics, right? Let's take a look at some. Maybe Dylan was speaking to us through his lyrics. So meet me in the morning, 56 in Wabasha. Dylan has clearly filled out a dispatch ticket before, right? So he can. There's maybe that message in his music. Cloud so swift, gates won't close, you ain't going nowhere. It certainly sounds like Dylan has struggled with Amazon VPC security policies before. And then from Ballad of a Thin Man, Dylan's singing about milking cash cows. He's singing about ticket-based workflow. He's singing about being oblivious to industry trends. Was he writing about the counterculture, or was he describing the telecom business model for the 21st century? So I think there's a there. I think Dylan was trying to speak to us. There's a message behind the lyrics. So maybe we'll go here and look at the parallels, right? By the end of this talk, hopefully we'll understand how Dylan's leap from folk to rock in 1965 parallels a lot of what our industry has gone through and is still going through as we leap from hardware-centric to cloud-centric today. So we'll hopefully have a little bit of fun with the overall comparison. But really the main theme here is how breaking tradition can drive innovation across completely different fields. So let's get back to that pivotal moment. In the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, Dylan's a hero of the acoustic folk scene. It's just him and his guitar singing protest songs like Blowin' in the Wind and Masters of War and A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. But the night he plugged in his electric guitar and played with a full band, it turned the whole folk industry and the whole folk world on its ear. Big parts of Dylan's audience were skeptical. Some booed loudly. They thought Dylan was betraying folk rock tradition by playing rock and roll. So one famous incident later that year, a heckler screamed Judas at him on stage, and Dylan's band's response was just to turn the amps up and play it even louder. But history also looks back on that moment as really the birth of folk rock. By blending folk storytelling with rock energy, Dylan invented a whole genre of music, and songs like a Rolling Stone that he played at that set showed that rock music, which was a genre at the time mostly known for riffs about sock hops and muscle cars, could have the depth and poetry of folk music. So Dylan's shift was controversial, and it expanded his art. And after Newport, he went on to write some of his greatest albums, like Highway 61 Revisited. And despite that backlash, his move into electric really rejuvenated his career. Here in the 21st century, look at our own industry, right? As we talk about work in the telecommunications industry, and we all know this industry has been around for decades, providing telephony services and data connectivity. And traditionally, these services require specialized hardware, and we've all struggled with carrier-grade switches and very specialized cable, craftsman-grade technicians manually configuring things in a reliable, but maybe not a very flexible way. And so our transition has been our version of going electric is going digital and cloud-based and network as a service. Throughout the 2000s, all of us in this community started shifting our network functions that used to be on specialized hardware into software that runs in different parts of clouds and data center-based industries. These have all been themes of this community getting together and discussing this over the past decade. And of course, now we're in this age of network as a service, right? On-demand connectivity, being able to plug directly into APIs and service portals and integrate with tools, where instead of waiting for weeks for circuits to come up, a business can dynamically open up and make changes and configurations to their network. But what this is also doing is it's allowing network to become an extensible part of many different types of cloud and multi-cloud architectures. The network is becoming a new instrument that joins the band that can add depth and flexibility to any creation. So just as Dylan amplified his music, telecom is really amplifying our capabilities with cloud and networking technology. Let's also pause and think about the pushback, because we've all been parts of vibrant discussions in this community that have kind of characterized some elements of this pushback. When Dylan went electric, many in the folk community felt betrayed. They booed him at concerts. Some folk music icons publicly criticized him for selling out to pop. Reaction was emotional. Folk music was really all about authenticity, and to them, plugging in an amp felt like a corruption of that purity. But in telecom's case, when cloud and virtualization first came up, there's a lot of folks either in this room or folks that we work with really pushed back. No way, this is how outages happen. We can't trust internet data centers with their levels of reliability. Our whole culture is built on specialized hardware for a reason. So there were heated internal debates, again, many times in this community. Some called it a fad. Some said it would only be for secondary non-critical services. Yet in both cases, innovators pushed forward. And we've all seen the breakthroughs. From Dylan's perspective, his perseverance gave us folk rock and inspired many other elements, and we'll talk about that in a second. Telecom's perseverance in cloudification is now giving us an entirely new a set of network services that we can get into and sort of map across the entire cloud landscape. Had either bowed to the backlash, we would have missed out on a lot of progress. So let's talk about Dylan's legacy. By taking that bold step, what did he end up influencing or inspiring? Right, Dylan showed us that popular music could carry deep, personal, even literary lyrics. That opened the doors to the whole singer-songwriter genre of the 60s and 70s, like Joni Mitchell, and Leonard Cohen, and even Bruce Springsteen. While Dylan's sound isn't punk, his attitude in 1965 was pure punk spirit. Right? He didn't care what people think. He did what he felt was right for his art. And that defiance inspired a lot of others throughout the 70s folk scene. Folks like Patti Smith was somebody who covered a lot of Bob Dylan songs. What might surprise you is that Dylan's lyricism and social commentary also paved the way for others in hip-hop. Right? Chuck D of Public Enemy has publicly talked about how much Dylan's approach towards lyricism and has been a big influence on what Public Enemy's done, and really as an inheritor of Dylan's protest music tradition. So after Dylan blurred the lines, it became a lot more acceptable to mix genres, and over time, artists stopped feeling confined to one genre box. Right? The idea that music can evolve and genres can fuse really became a big part of Dylan's legacy and what he inspired. So you think about like folks like David Bowie taking on different personas, or even Taylor Swift going from country to pop across, and different kinds of folk transitions across all of her eras, are all inheritors of that legacy. I remember somebody talked about Taylor Swift last year as well. So Dylan felt he had a role to play. He had a role to play in country music. He had a role to play in gospel music. He had a role to play in big-time rock collaborations, like with the Traveling Wilburys, right? He had a role to play in movie soundtracks. In fact, he even wrote the soundtrack for Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and he starred.
Who are you? That's a good question.
So networking technology is also going through a shift. Right? Networking technology and the landscape, there's been a lot of talk here at the event. It's been really great to see everyone's perspectives aligning around how much the topology is shifting in our industry. And that shift, it's worth looking back on where that came from. Right? The first generation of cloud computing was built on infrastructure designed for fundamentally telco to telco interconnect based on voice exchange patterns from 40 to 50 years ago, pre-Bell. Right? Internet exchanges largely got built up around the same places. When cloud computing was first launched, it was all on the internet. But when they started entertaining private connectivity into different types of cloud patterns, again, that was all anchored against the same interconnect places and the same interconnect points that were established during the early phone years. So we're in this next generation of data centers, this sort of cloud 2.0 range that Ethan Blodgett spoke about yesterday, that Dave Ward just penned a white paper and published up on Lumen's site. It really digs into the changing topology that we're seeing build out and the changing dynamics that are in the industry. A lot has been covered around the data center builds and the AI factory builds and the neocloud builds, but there's rarely a mention of what network does and connectivity does in such a cornerstone role in this build out. So we're working, as many of the folks in this room are on the ground floor of working with taking our networks and making sure that they're adapting to all those new facilities that are coming online, that are chasing power patterns and chasing water patterns and chasing geography into places where we haven't traditionally had a lot of density of network connectivity. So let's explore the way that NAS is really being reinvented across the physical, the digital, and the connected ecosystem dimensions. At the physical layer, right, this is all about plugging in the right types of instruments. And so when we think physical, there's a whole bunch we've seen a lot of the good maps and the changing geography of the cloud landscape that we're tapping into and taking our network into. But this graphic, I think, probably tells the story the most. Ethan shared this a little bit yesterday. We all know cloud networking for AI is about feeding the GPU. GPUs don't really get economically viable today unless they're at close to 100% utilization pretty consistently. So feeding data into the GPU is a vital part of the equation. The chart there on the left compares what it's like to egress a petabyte of data into an AI data center. So if you go and rent an AI workload and you have a 10 gig link and a training against a petabyte data set, you're paying for 222 hours of idle time just to move your data into that cloud. The middle part of the chart starts to compare the cost. So if you just use a simple measure of renting a GPU cluster for $2K an hour, that's going to add up to $431,000 of idle time you're paying for just to load your training data into that GPU. So changing transport from 10 gig to 400 gig reduces that by a factor of 40. Right, so we can all see the ability to go and take advantage of high-end speed for the topology that's shifting. Being able to get to the kinds of high-end speed necessary is going to be a vital equation to take, whether that's 400 gig links or whether we're lagging together equal cost, smaller links on multipath. It shows that the need to get to 1.6 terabyte can't get here soon enough. And remember, this example is just all on petabyte scale. Right, the size and the storage that we're talking about for AI training is rapidly approaching exabyte scale. So multiply all this by 1,000. So the economic value of what the network brings to all these investments in AI data centers and neoclouds is becoming pretty clear. But the other thing that we all need to think about, and we're all in the process of innovating, and you hear a lot of examples out there in the innovation stations, is the digital layer. And what's the mixing board? How are we mixing these locations together, and how are we controlling the elements of the physical topology into kind of a combined track? Lumen, we have an approach towards this. We call it our Lumen connectivity fabric. It's really our version of our engine that delivers network as a service. We look at things through a universal port layer, As there's been a lot of talk here about universal ports and multi-use ports, configuring things together at the physical layer. Layer 2 services that we can take across the entire e-services suite, and then being able to connect those up to other value-added services, whether that's public IP routing or whether that's private IP networking or security services or unified optimized paths to unified communications, is all part of what we deliver out of our mixing board. But there's so many different ways to configure. There's so many different ways that everyone in the industry is innovating in that space. So the connected ecosystem, bringing the whole band together. Right? And so what that starts to look like, in our view, is different types of fabrics that are adapting to different types of workloads and different types of fabrics being aligned to different business outcomes. So taking that configurability across your control plane, and if you're running an application that wants to use maybe an authentication service from Microsoft, but it's going to have runtime that's going to be running in Google, and maybe it's using a data structure that's over in AWS, weaving together a multi-cloud app fabric becomes a possibility as you start to think about rolling that track together and producing that between those collaborators. If you want to take your data protection software that's running in your choice of public cloud, and you want to take that data protection software and run it on-prem, as well as in your corporate enterprise data center, you can weave together a data protection fabric for cyber resilience or for overall disaster recovery. Having an AI call center fabric that links together your choice of inferencing engine, your choice of call center software, the actual people who are working in your call center, and the applications that house all of your ERP data, having an AI call center fabric wove together across your NAS platform becomes something that's more and more possible, especially in the age of AI and private inferencing, and as enterprises start to innovate with all the different ways that they can tack it together. So let's wrap it up. Getting back to that moment at the Newport Folk Festival, Pete Seeger ended up writing Bob Dylan a letter and tried to clear the air. This is a postcard from the Dylan archives, and where Pete Seeger explains that he wasn't angry at Bob Dylan for going electric. Right? He was just critical of the sound mix. He wanted to cut the cable because he just thought the sound mix was terrible and the lyrics weren't getting through. So basically, he wanted better tuning. So whether that's revisionist history from Pete Seeger many years later or not, I'm not really sure we'll ever know. But I think the disruption that Dylan created was worth the drama. So a couple of parallels here we can just sort of sum up. Dylan disrupted the folk scene with a focus on 3 clear elements. Physical, right? He plugged in his electric guitar. Digital, he eventually did get the mix right. And in his collaborative ecosystem, he inspired and left a history of creative agility. Our industry is also primed for that level of transformation. At the physical layer, things are changing. The changing face of clouds and data centers and AI factories and neoclouds is really changing what we need to do at the physical topology layer. The digital, getting the mix right between speed and attached services and all the different ways that we can use NAS to weave together the right digital experiences for our customers. And then at that ecosystem layer, collaborating with a range of hyperscalers and service clouds and AI factories to forge the future of AI. So if we do all that, I think we potentially avoid the scenario that maybe Bob Dylan was warning us about in that song Subterranean Homesick Blues. And I might be misremembering the lyrics here, but there's a point where he talks about a man coming up to him looking for, I think, 100 gigs. There we go. Thank you, everyone, for listening. You've been a great audience. Hope everybody enjoys the rest of the event.